everybody. So we're going to get started with our lecture. I'm going to pull this lecture slides up. But while I do so, I just want to first go over the fact that we're going to talk about religion and spirituality this week. We're going to talk about its links to sexism, its links to female oppression, and LGBTQ plus oppression. And that has a lot of weight. So a person's religious ideology and their links to their own religious concepts are something that people hold really, really dear to them. It becomes a source of non-topic amongst close friends and family, and it's something that can hold a lot of political and social power. And so as we talk about this, we need to look towards being both respectful and also look towards our own selves in order to find that place where we can actively critique and have conversations about our own religious ideologies, our own religions, in ways that are productive and in ways that help to create less oppression in this world. And so we're going to talk about religion and its history and its linked to colonialism, and it's linked to some atrocities that are going to be hard to hear, but they're important conversations to have, and I want to make sure that we are doing so in a respectful and in an open space. So let's get started. So we're going to talk about the good things and the negative outcomes that are religion and women. And so religion can be very empowering for women. It can bring unity. It can be a place to feel like you can help those in need. It can be a place of hope. It can be a place of refuge in times of crisis. It can be a place where you have support groups, where you have friends, where you strengthen family ties, which are all really good things. The core root of religion within human society really strives down to being able to form non-kin-based relationships with people who think and share similar ideas. And this allowed societies to operate outside of just like, again, small kin-based structures that were more nomadic, to be more of societal structures that operated with many, many, many different kin-based groups. However, in doing that, religion also created space for there to be an othering, right? So in creating non-kin-based relationships based on ideas, these ideas had to be different from other people's ideas in order to create that cohesion. And thus it automatically created an us and a them, and that us being good and that them being bad. And that allowed the space to a place for an intolerance, and it allows a vehicle for hate, distrust of outsiders, and judgment. It can be a place that causes shame, self-hate, and isolation if you carry one of the statuses of one of the groups that is othered by your religious ideas. It can be a great place that causes great harms, and you just take some of the examples such as the Inquisition or some of the religious wars that even are currently happening within our global context. It can be a place where resources are lacking or that perpetuate harms in times of violence, such as sexual violence against women, which we will get into a little bit later in this lecture. It can be a source of colonialization, and it can be at the root of genocidal cultural acts against Indigenous persons, and has been and has had a significant history in creating the destruction of Indigenous religion or justifying the genocide of people based on the otherness or the them idea that is created out of having a religion that is not your own. And it can be a place that silences you, that ranks you as less than, or that creates systems of power that leave you feeling like you have limited options. And so we're going to get into some of those things a little more in depth, but we wanted to just get started with an intro of some of the good and some of the bad. Again, we're going to talk about oppression first, because this is a class that really looks to critically reflect on society in a way that shows the harms that can happen when someone gets marginalized within their own society. And religion has a way in which it can marginalize a large portion of the population. Religion is personal, but it's also political. It's also the thing that garners what policies we want to create, what policies we want to get rid of, what policies or what people we want to include in those policies, and what people we don't. The four major ways women are oppressed within religion are going to be that there's a hierarchy of genders within religion. There's the exclusion of rituals and roles within leadership. There is the fact that church can create and maintain women's oppression, and we're going to talk about that a little bit in a minute, and that religion expresses power over women. So when we're talking about the gender hierarchy, we're really talking about how particularly the main four religions and the Abrahamic religions, in which are Islam, the Jewish faith, and the Christian-based faiths, which are the major world religions at this point, operate under writings and Bibles and other writings that create messaging surrounding the idea that the male is the leaders, that male create leadership roles, that male is God, that male, and we'll kind of get into the language a little bit more here in a little bit, but really the messaging that there is this need for women to be subservient to men, a need for them to follow the leads of men, and so on. So women are excluded not just in roles of leadership, but they're also excluded in where and when they can pray. They're excluded from being able to teach men in certain contexts. They're excluded from being able to perform certain religious functions, such as baptisms or being able to marry people, depending on what religion, what sect of which religion you are in. And they also are not allowed to hold jobs that are considered representative of God. So things of ministries, or things like the Pope in the Catholic faith, things that are there to specifically represent God and God's ideas and words. Church laws can create or maintain women's oppression, including requiring submission to the husband, even when that is violent, and maintaining those relationships, even when those are violent. Sorry about that. It also can include regulating sexuality and or limiting that, depending on how inclusive they are to LGBTQ+, and or determining that women need to be the kind of gatekeeper, whereas men are allowed to, while also somehow being the temptress and or being the person that men are supposed to be geared towards wanting or striving to be with. And at the same time, they have to hold their virginity, and they also have to hold, they also have to be the ones that keep this outraged male lust in check. So there's kind of this duality here and this unreasonable expectations. They also gender performances, so who and what you can do, and are based on gender. Not allowing divorce, even in abusive relationships, and maintaining that women are responsible for abuse by not being able to be better gatekeepers of their husband's lust and or their husband's violence or their husband's tendencies to act a certain way. They can also express their power over women and or other marginalized groups, and there's a long history of religion and religious-based wars within the world. You can look at just the Christian faith, and you can talk about the Inquisition, the hunt for witchcraft, which was really just a subversion of female autonomy and authority. And so women that did not feel they needed to have husbands, or did not feel like they needed to, or felt like they could have children outside of wedlock, or felt like that they didn't have to adhere to cultural norms, or queer women were often part of those that were considered witches and or were burned at the stake. Shutting down women's groups in churches due to feminist ideologies. So there's a lot of breaking down or shutting down those women's groups within religious institutions that adhere or critique the religious institutions itself. They reinforce racism and Eurocentrism. There's a lot of history of religion being used as the rationale for the genocide of indigenous persons and or in colonialization more broadly in the world. It defended slavery, and the KKK is considered a religious organization and is often held in church-based gatherings. Nazism was again the idea that that for this racial purity idea and or this religious purity kind of idea, and it was tied into Christianity in those particular regions. And the religious right currently operating in very extremist ways. Think of groups like the Proud Boys, think of things of that nature that tend to get linked into Christianity and the ultra religious right. And again, power over women also doesn't just happen in the US, right? Or within the context of Christianity. You got the racial and religious caste system in India. You have different Muslim variations that require or can be linked to oppressive ideologies about what and how women can interact with society and in what ways they can be dressed or what roles they can play. Now, I will say that that's not every Muslim variation, as it is not every Christian variation. So that thoroughly depends on where you are, the politics of the region, and how those religions are interacting with those different other societal concepts. So moving into where it can be empowering. So you have Islamic feminism, which is an entire sect of Muslim women who really work to encourage other women, who really work within their communities, who are really working towards achieving certain levels of hierarchy, breaking certain levels of hierarchy within their religious context, and really feel enlightened to not have to wear the veils, or sometimes even being able to wear those more religious contexts, including the more prominently the hijab than the veils, but being able to show off who they are within society's context. You have LGBTQ plus Christian organizations who really work to break down barriers of inclusion. You have women organizations and group within churches that really work to create unity within the women of those particular religious ideologies. You have roles in ministries that allow them to see political power within their communities and within specific women and these political powers. A great example of this are Black churches and the civil rights movement, especially Black women's groups in churches and the civil rights movements. Without them, there would have been no really push for fundraising, really push for like message bringing. Like there was a lot of educating people how to vote after they garnered the right to vote. So a lot of political work happens within the religious institutions in several different minority communities. Personal and community power within matriarchal religion. So there's a lot of matriarchal religion still globally, and a lot of personal and community power stems out of, for women, stems out of those particular ideologies. Social justice within the Jewish faith, again, having a religion that was a source of oppression for so long and in such dramatic ways during the Nazi regime, really allowed the especially reformist Jewish faith to really sect of the Jewish faith to really have heart-to-heart conversations with themselves about how they wanted to create inclusive spaces and to be at the forefront of social justice for other oppressed people in communities, and to work towards not becoming a religious ideology that continues to create religious persecution that they themselves had felt. Women's religious, okay, so we already talked about that. There's power in having faith and that ability to feel like you have something to draw from when you continue to fight social justice movements or you continue to fight sexism in everyday context. And then there's a power within the connection to your surrounding, to the earth. I'm not entirely sure what happened there. It became hearth instead of earth, so I'm sorry about that. And to healing, etc. When you take out religion, really work towards spirituality, there was a lot of different connections that women felt with their surroundings, with other women, in healing their own relationships and healing their own connections to the earth itself. So again, we talked about this a little bit already, but within a lot of religious texts, especially in our main core, being the Quran, the Torah, and the New and Old Testament, the Old Testament being also part of the Torah and part of the Quran, are all built on similar ideologies or similar texts. And just talking about how language holds power, it holds meaning. God continues to be a masculine ideology in most of these texts. The life-giving goddess and the warring god really is where this stems from. And then and those really stem from the relationships or the religions that predicated these particular monotheistic religions, or meaning religions that were based on one deity, and these one deity generally were masculine in nature. So it reflected a more societal exclusion of women, and so really getting rid of that multiple gods with multiple different sexes or demographics really was a reflection of societal exclusion of those other demographics. Feminist theologians have found alternative feminine images, have really catered towards trying to bring forth and bring center the females within these stories or within these texts in ways that weren't happening before. And there's political of changing the masculine God language and imagery. So you also have those who literally flip the script and work towards God as mother, God as female, and really work towards what does that mean for how we look at our religious text. I put in here a bunch of examples of different kinds of gods, goddesses throughout religious, different religions that are practiced within the world and throughout time and space. And so there's really a whole bunch of different information on here, but it's just an idea to show kind of the difference between those single God-like masculine structures and the wide variety of structures that were there and present prior to that. So there's been a lot of reinterpreting the religious connotations. So the theology and really this male normative is something that is pretty consistent in our current three major religions, right? However, when you talk about those in context to, say, other religions, that's not always the case. And so, again, trying to bring women's experience to the center is a main principle for females in theology. And there's a difference between reinterpretation, which really involves the reconstructing of passages that are particularly problematic for women, and highlighting the reintegrating of existing equality across genders, and then reconstructing, which is really looking into the margins or the edges of the text and really looking for certain passages that already exist and really kind of restructuring them or reconstructing the stories overall. So we recreate the narratives of women who are left out or not focused on, and in doing that, you re-examine the religious text itself. Quakers have always kind of included women as equal, and so that's an example your book gives of ways in which Christianity got reconstructed. um, and or is constructed in a different way. LGBT also have reconstructions that allow for more inclusive practices, and you're going to see more and more religions that have these kind of break-offs, like the Methodist Church, for example, who recently decided to split kind of canon, where there was a part that wanted to be more traditional and less inclusive, and a part that wanted to allow female and LGBTQ plus members to be part of their leadership roles and to take on roles, including being pastors and things of that nature. And then you have post-colonial theologians who are really looking at being able to take the cultural and historic context that is colonialization and try to acknowledge and alleviate the continuation of that within their religious ideologies. And then you have those who are, again, within that Muslim faith that are working towards gender equality as well. And there's a big push for that here in the United States. So you also, on top of that, have this ability to create spiritual traditions. Sometimes women feel a need for a new spiritual tradition because, again, there's this current religious texts and practices are just too linked in the patriarchal structure, and they just really want to divide from that. The lack of LGBTQ plus inclusion, or because religions can be androcentric or white-centered. Examples of spirituality outside of major religions can include meditation practices, art and poetry, prayer and ritual, depending on what kind of spirituality a person wants to be, and or spirituality within social action. And it creates a connectedness with creations, with other people, and the divine within themselves. Female spirituality often ends up being about interconnectedness and how we as humans are all interconnected, and we as humans are interconnected with our earth. And female spirituality is also generally very nature-centered or nature-connected. The last little bit I'm going to get into is the article about, or the last little article passage within the chapter section called Christian Fragility, or talking about Christian fragility. And it's really based on this idea of white fragility that D'Angelo talked about, which was an emotional or psychological state for white people in which racial stress became intolerable. This racial stress arises when white folks are confronted by their own racial privilege or find themselves in situations that are not racially familiar. And so really this came down to talking about a history in this country, or talking about context in this country that white people didn't experience to white people, and that really garnered a disconnect and a desire to disenfranchise that information as invalid in order to not deal with the positionality that might be recirculating or perpetuating those kinds of violences within our communities. And this created this white insulation, and the same, and she compares, the author compares these white insulations, or these white kind of areas where this was happening, to kind of Christian enclaves, and how Christianity has found similar nodes and similar patterns. And then in this, leaders become truth, opposition becomes dangerous, and thus they form this need to fight back. And what that does is becomes this God versus the government, and this government is bad, thus we have to create our own government, or create governments that more adequately represents our God and our ideologies, which can create a very problematic situation in a country like the US, where it is supposed to be based on no one religion taking priority over others, although there's always been a link to our historic figures and Christianity, and we get into that kind of in another one of our readings. But it also talks about there being this unpreparedness for difference, and this privileging of one run religion can make them feel like their ideas are the only social norm and what it's always been, when that's not always the case. And that leads to them really playing the victim when any kind of progress or diversity gets accepted or acknowledged within a particular space. And that creates, again, these situations where you have really big pushback for or against for specific policies against different peoples. So lastly, we're going to go over some of our 3 little articles real quick, and then I'm just going to call it because this will be just one long lecture. So the Fundamentalism and the Control of Women article really was talking about the examples of controlling women. So being veiled or physically covered, lacking access to public spheres or spaces, prohibiting or from testifying or legal options for harms that are done to them, being unable to own property or wealth, being unable to divorce or end relationships, being unable to make their own reproductive choices. And this is still something that is happening regularly, even within the US, depending on what kind of Christianity sect you're in. There's not a root cause. There's not a root, like controlling women is not the root cause of fundamentalism, but it is an inevitable side effect because of the patriarchal lineage there is to fundamentalism within the major religions that we currently have operating in this country and or worldly. Fear is really leads to a need for power and control. And really they talk about this within the pro-life movement and the inconsistency of the pro-fetus life, but also these same crowds usually are about increased military action. They support the death penalty and decreasing of social programs that are there to increase the welfare of children. And so this disconnect in the pro-life movement has really been a source of really talking about the pro-life movement as more of a control of women as opposed to being about the sanctity of life in any capacity. And then there was a section about the world of difference. So really Americans, especially white Americans, worry about their place in this diversifying global stage, and that religion, that their own religion being their consistency and the place to orient themselves. And so in doing that, they have to butt up against any diversity and also butt up against any kind of science that does not adhere to those specific ideologies, because that is their constant. And in doing that, it creates this space that's not only in the US, but in other things, but it creates this idea of failed promises, which creates the chaos in their life and circumstances that can't be comprehended or managed within their current ideological structure, which then just causes them to completely null and reject any of those circumstances or any of those life situations as something that are completely invalid, because that doesn't fit under their mold, their model. And as soon as that gets butt up against, there's a wall there that is essentially there as their own defense, but does so in a very toxic way. Women are easy magnets for this fear due to them being coded as vulnerable and coded as something societally in need of protecting. So the article about Buddhist nuns in Nepal, this is one of my favorite ones because it just talks about the ways in which empowerment and disenfranchisement can coexist within women that are in leadership roles in religion. And so I'm not going to try to pronounce these because I do not want to get them wrong, but these are the words that they consider to be empowerment, and their empowerment is based on the dismantling of ignorance, which I found very fascinating and something that I think is interesting. Women within these contexts or within these social structures are generally considered second-class citizens, and ideologies, and these ideologies of being second class or being a gendered hierarchical structure are more based on society than their actual fundamental tenets of Buddhism, because within Buddhism, there is not something inherently unequal about any kind of amongst the genders within their religion. There's an in-depth, this particular article was an in-depth study of 6 nuns. They ranged in age and they ranged in background, and they ranged in varying family support in their choice to become nuns. They were more educated than the average woman in the area. But when they were talking about empowerment, they were talking about empowerment through education. They were all educated and brought in through the traditions of what becoming a nun entails them, and that includes an education-based component. They felt empowered through their community involvement and being able to possibly help empower other women. Through this involvement, they felt empowerment through the possibility of women in obtaining enlightenment, and due to the fact that these Buddhism isn't inherently about just males achieving enlightenment, that possibility for women as well felt very empowering to them. And so they also liked to acknowledge how their ideologies and practices were in flux. And so depending on social context and depending on their own context, they could see where Buddhism was able to kind of ebb and flow and fill in or make relevant to the society as it changes or grows or adapts. And then the last one we're going to talk about is Douglas. It really talks about how evangelicals became kind of white. And again, this falls down to that same ideology, right? That same Christian fragility idea that we were talking about earlier, where shifting demographics really became something that felt like a hindrance, felt concerned. And it falls into this Anglo-Saxon myth, this idea that all Christians and Christ and Europeans somehow are more than or are the divine right. They're the people that are supposed to be in charge. They're the people that are supposed to have the wealth and are supposed to be the people in power. And that's something that's been consistent throughout all of the US history and can be traced back to the founding fathers. It's linked to the ideas of racial purity and movements such as Nazism. And whiteness and Christianity have always been kind of linked in this national mission. And that's why, again, it's been linked to defending slavery and been linked to very distinctive racial scripts. And that ties into this idea of, again, colonialism or the conversion of foreigners. And that sets up the standard that Christian whiteness becomes what is the real American versus anyone that is not Christian becomes a foreigner that we have to convert and or is not real. That's not a real American. And this becomes this racist assumption of any other group. And you could hear a lot of that in Make America Great Again slogans talking about specifically like say the connection between in some of this talk between Mexicans and being like rapists or murderers or drug dealers. These super negative assumptions that are homogenizing and in no way, shape, or form the vast majority of any of this category. And it became more about making America white again, as opposed to really an individual morality or any kind of Christian moral compass and or any kind of specific denomination of any kind of religious sect. And it was more about the more threatened the white demographic felt, the more fierce the defense of Anglo-Saxon white supremacy became. And I thought that this quote kind of encompassed what this article was talking about, because really what it came down to was when there was pushback or they felt like their demographic was going to be outweighed or possibly the minority, and they knew how the minority was treated in this country, they no longer wanted to be the minority, and thus there was a consistent amount of pushback to make sure that that wasn't the case. And so in doing so, Trump became the candidate because he didn't need to embody specific Christian morals. He needed to only be able to strike a specific kind of fear and be able to cater to a specific kind of defense of that fear. And that fear really became of minority individuals and specifically racial minorities, and being able to strike fear on white people being the minority, and then being able to be treated as minorities are treated in this country. And that in and of itself is telling. And so that's really all we have for you for this module. I hope that you guys are doing well. Please reach out if you need anything as your projects are starting to go through, or projects, as the end of term stuff starts to come through, and as you start working through that particular political letter to a senator. So please reach out and let me know if you need anything, and I'm here if you need it. So have a good week.